Good afternoon. I'm here to tell you that I am a bad economist. I let my professional membership in the American Economics Association lapse, and I didn't notice until this week when I attempted to register for the annual meeting in January. The portal on the website invited me to renew my membership, and so I clicked the link. To my surprise, I was confronted with a large pop-up box containing a detailed AEA Code of Professional Conduct. The code contains many high-minded statements, such as principles of professional conduct should guide economists in academia, government, nonprofit, and the private sectors. And economists have a professional obligation to conduct civil and respectful discourse in all forms. So far, so good. But the code also contained the following doozy. The AEA seeks to create a professional environment with equal opportunity and fair treatment for all economists, regardless of age, sex, gender identity and expression, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, health condition, marital status, parental status, genetic information, political affiliation, professional status, or personal connections. This is quite seriously the longest list of possible treatment classes I have ever seen. At the bottom of the pop-up box, I was asked to click a button affirming the following. I have read and agree with the Code of Conduct. I had to click this button to renew my membership. I gave it some thought. Is there anything in this statement as written that I cannot agree to? Thankfully, there is just enough ambiguity in that statement that I felt I could affirm it. I do strive and always will strive to treat every person in my professional sphere with the full measure of human respect and Christian charity, full stop. But if equal opportunity and fair treatment are construed now or in the future to mean that I must affirm explicitly that I agree with the self-identification of a transgendered individual, or that I agree with the term sexual orientation, well, then I will have a problem signing the statement. And I'll become a really bad economist, an exile from the class of professionals. It seems to be where things are going. And how long until I cannot click that box? Too bad one of the protected classes isn't people who have conscience objections to signing the statement. But that's never how these revolutions work, is it? Now, thanks be to God, the AEA isn't my employer, and this isn't going to get too sticky for me as long as I am teaching at Catholic University. But I have an economist friend who I've known for more than 20 years, working at a federal agency in Washington, D.C. He has been asked to sign an affidavit which affirms some of those things. The statement is so explicit that he has sought out consultation with theologians in Rome to assess whether there's any way that he can sign the statement without compromising his faith. The theologians think that he cannot. The future is already here for people like my friend. Now, the AEA's Code of Conduct and the various forms of compliance that are implemented and overseen by the AEA are entrusted to a standing committee of the AEA, established in 2018 when the code was adopted, the Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Professional Conduct. Thus, we can mark 2018 as the year that the AEA became woke. Fairly late to the game, perhaps, but we couldn't have expected better, its critics will say, from an organization with deep ties to American racism, and they have a point. Many prominent American economists from the early 20th century, great gurus of social engineering, were fervent racists and eugenicists. Very recently, for instance, at the behest of Janet Yellen, who served as the 2020 AEA president, the AEA removed the name of Richard Ely from a long-standing AEA lecture series, since whatever his economic contributions, Ely wrote approvingly of slavery, eugenics, favored segregation, and hated immigrants. The AEA is finally waking up to its own shameful past. But downstream from this wokeness is a misguided attempt to prevent future injustice by aligning its members, including me, around a falsehood. That falsehood is that the root of injustice is the hatred of difference. But this is not the root of injustice. Sin is the root of injustice, and sin is disobedience of God's law. Therefore, racism, which violates God's law, is unjust But so too is fornication of any kind. It is therefore false and basically absurd to say that if we reject racism, we must also reject standards for sexual behavior on the grounds that what they have in common is making distinctions between people. Racists make distinctions on the grounds of skin color, which is a diversity God intended and celebrates. But those who reject fornication, call them traditionalists or religious conservatives, make distinctions on the grounds of the sixth and ninth commandments, which we are directed by God to uphold. So if wokeness sometimes starts someplace good, because it lacks a coherent understanding of human sin, it makes grave category errors, which perpetuate the very injustices it wants to prevent. In the attempt to root out sexists and racists, it roots out traditionalists, Christians, and all those who make distinctions between persons of any kind, even those commanded by God. Never mind that the woke AEA is making a distinction between people on the basis of who is making distinctions. The rules against making distinctions don't apply to the woke commissars. Unfortunately, my story about the AEA reflects a broader culture of corporate America, which has infected academia in just the same measure. What are the notes of this story? The cult of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Code language, literally and figuratively. There is a code of conduct into which we are expected to be induced, but there is also a hidden code. You will nowhere find diversity or equity well defined, but everyone is supposed to know what it stands for. And no apology is made for the value of diversity and equity. Everyone is supposed to know that that is good. Understanding these things is part of the code. Finally, there is the persistent use of executive level change managers who are deputized to represent the party and not the firm per se. Hence, I call them commissars of wokeness, equipped with various kinds of coercive tactics. Just click this button if you want to register, and to employ the language of alignment as its own code word. It's to this fact of executive level change managers, such as the committee at the AEA, that I want to spend some more time examining today. In a confident September article, the Harvard Business Review asked, "Do you know why your company needs a chief diversity officer?" Amazingly, the article doesn't make the case for a CDO, as these officers are sometimes called. It is instead breezily asserted in the opening lines that racial inequalities are embedded deep in the systems in which we operate each day: neighborhoods, schools, stores, banks, courts, housing markets, and workplaces. It also asserts that many organizations have made promises to change the way they operate. Why now? We are told that many organizations are feeling pressure from employees, customers, investors, and suppliers to get serious about DEI. The article is in fact broadly informative about what is happening. First, if you are in the market for a CDO, it tells us, look for 12 to 15 years of DEI experience. But because it's a war for top talent right now, you may need to consider potential CDOs with broader backgrounds. What is critical, the Harvard Business Review tells us, is the ability to influence and be a change agent, to design strategy and deliver results, to create metrics and drive accountability, and to communicate effectively across all levels of the hierarchy. Impressive. We learned, for instance, that Walmart's CDO was an IT leader before he stepped into the role, and the counterpart at Salesforce was in marketing operations before leading DEI. And Gucci's former CDO had a career in finance prior to diversity, equity, and inclusion. How much of a war is it for top talent? Well, job listings for DEI officers increased a whopping 35% between 2016 and 18 alone. And as I'll note, there are concentrated external pressures, in addition to some of this coming from within. A number of states have followed California's lead, requiring percent female representation on corporate boards. This has a cultural spillover to C-suites in a variety of ways. Second, Harvard Business Review tells us that an effective CDO leader should report directly to the CEO or to the head of HR with a dotted line to the CEO. If he or she isn't in the C-suite, they'd better have full access to and support from the entire C-suite, and a seat at the senior leadership table if you want to see meaningful change. In addition, CDOs need dedicated resources to transform an organization. How much? For a small org, we are told a commitment of at least $500,000 is needed to get out of the starting gate, implementing best practices, trainings, partnerships. Clearly, the CDO will soon need to make additional hires. Be prepared for the DEI efforts to become not just the work of a single executive level change agent, but an entire office and team within the administration of the firm. For large organizations, CDOs will need a team of 5 or more people and a budget starting in the 2 million range. If we find these figures at all bracing, the article reminds us that building an end-to-end inclusion system takes money, talent, and commitment. Third, Harvard Business Review suggests that a CDO's position, like any other, needs to have measurable goalposts. How will you track progress, it asks, urging that what gets measured gets done. It offers suggestions. Workforce diversity targets, with your legal team, of course, revision of key policies such as pay equity, paid parental leave, bereavement leave, the use of DEI pledges, like codes of conduct, executive compensation tied to goalposts, boards who monitor DEI initiatives, and so forth. Finally, the Harvard Business Review prods us to think about the fact that CDOs might need to have influence over your products and services. Do your products avoid cultural stereotyping? Do you work with diverse suppliers and vendors? The article recommends that your workforce be configured to represent the multicultural consumer you serve. But it also recommends that you understand how your products show up in the marketplace. What is ultimately advised in this short piece, without using so many words, is the total transformation of your business from the inside out, according to the cult of diversity, facilitated by executive level change agents, fully equipped and generously resourced to bring your company into line with an agenda that is in fact being set from without the party. How so? Well, if it were set from within, you wouldn't need the change agent. In this sense, CDOs blur the line between colleague and commissar. They seem to be your peer, your colleague, but they answer to another authority. You know it, and they know it. These are not commissars appointed by a state. You are instead pressed into hiring them voluntarily to avoid lawsuits, mobs, protests, bad press, boycotts. And at some point, you are pressed into it so as not to be the only backwards firm left behind. Just as a point of fact, diversity training was the prelude to the CDO trend. And this began in the 1980s as a strategy for businesses to avoid civil rights lawsuits. Eventually, the CDO becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You might not need one today, but when there are enough of us, you certainly will need one ipso facto. Depending on the circumstances, your DEI budget might start to look like protection money. But just how are firms led to adopt CDOs? One answer is that firms are themselves subject to aggressive marketing by other firms, which seek to profit from their lack of knowledge and perceived vulnerability. Global PR giant Weber Shandwick, with 500 million in revenue, offers traditional anodyne services like brand marketing and public relations, but it is also prepared to offer complete consulting services under the headings of change management and diversity, equity, and inclusion. They tell prospective clients that they will be with them through their most critical transformation moments, crafting a compelling case for change, counseling C-suite leaders, and providing meaning and context for employees. They offer a cultural vigilance suite of services to proactively surface cultural vulnerabilities, develop crisis response strategies, and purposefully shift your culture to support business strategy and ethical behavior. I don't know about you, but I don't want to know how they proactively surface cultural vulnerabilities. In any case, they make a tremendously compelling case that you and your firm will be subject to very poor outcomes if you don't initiate a change strategy, and better yet, under their guidance. But Weber Shandwick also provides valuable insight into the black box of DEI efforts at major corps. In a research report drawn from a survey of 500 senior-level DEI professionals, over half said that external partners were very important in achieving their DEI goals inside the firm. What sort of partners? Communications, PR, and marketing agencies like Weber Shandwick, industry peers, and management consultancies, but also academia, media, and national government officials were also ranked as very important external partners. In other words, CDOs who work for the firm say that they depend upon PR firms, consultancies, the media, academia, and state and local governments to help oversee and implement change inside the firm. It is easy to see how the boundaries of the firm begin to blur. It is also easy to see why recruiting matters so much to the work of DEI officers. New hires that are recruited on the basis of DEI measures, that is, to help make the workforce more diverse, are more likely to contribute to the DEI goals and therefore provide self-fulfilling feedback loops to upper management. This process altogether is euphemistically called alignment. Weber Shandwick estimates that being misaligned, defined simply as having far to go to meet your DEI goals, costs US businesses nearly $7 billion per month in turnover costs. Thus, CDOs are not satisfied merely to provide diversity training, as they might have been in the past. They are now engaged in a long-term struggle to align the firm, to recruit and retain new workers according to DEI standards, which are rarely articulated in public, and to which no one can offer a question of feasibility. Remember that ill-fated programmer at Google. So Kathy Besant, the Chief Operating and Tech Officer for Bank of America, says, we will know we've reached equality of opportunity when we have equal representation in the CEO position. And Mike Wirth at Chevron says, there's never a finish line for DEI work. But what if there aren't enough women who want to be executives or programmers? There are deep and important questions in these areas which simply cannot be asked. Instead, the bottom line of the party line remains, we'll know it when we see it, they say. The Weber Shandwick report states that the top-ranked priorities for CDOs over the next 12 to 18 months include recruiting diverse talent, women, minorities, LGBTQ staff, diversity and inclusion training of current staff, and fostering a diverse and inclusive workplace culture. What else do we know about the CDO tidal wave? The Wall Street Journal reports that over 60% of Fortune 500 firms already have a CDO of some kind. And based on executive level job postings, we know that number is growing. In 2018, the academic business journal, Human Resource Management, published an important study looking at various state level predictors of the trend. Among their findings, they show that state level regulatory environments do serve as crucial coercive mechanisms that guide organizations to adopt new practices. Using data from a sample of S&P 500 firms, they find that the adoption rates of CDOs for firms headquartered in legalized gay marriage states is 68% higher than for firms headquartered in other states. They also show that having a more diverse workforce, measured by industry female employment base, leads to a higher adoption rate for CDOs, and that a 10% increase in female representation in top management leads to an almost 20% increase in CDO adoptions. Thus, women are both a leading and a lagging indicator of CDO presence. Having more women employees at any level predicts CDO adoption, and CDO adoption predicts having more women employees. Maybe for a further conference, we should explore the question of women and wokeness. What sense can we make of all of this? CDOs and DEI officers are a primary aspect of woke capitalism. They blur the boundaries of the firm in unprecedented ways. They are part colleague, part commissar. And to whom do they answer? To whom do they belong? Does their present ubiquity in corporate life challenge the idea that American enterprise is really independent from the state? Still, there are lessons to be learned. Imagine if just one aspect of the Christian life, reading the scriptures, praying with family, attending worship services, received as much devoted attention as American C-suites together with media, academia, and government give to this one goal, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the lesson really is, if you want to change a culture, you can change a culture. Not everything simply bubbles up from the bottom without direction. Culture arises from the things that people believe. And with enough gentle coercion, repetition, and targeting, you can start to create new habits of belief in any human community, workplace or otherwise. Perhaps we can imagine in the future or now a Christian spin-off of the CDO, the Chief Dignity Officer. Christianity has always and everywhere found ways to Christianize secular traditions. And maybe this also is something that can be Christianized, not among Fortune 500 companies today, but in our small businesses, our homes, and even our parishes. What gets measured gets done, the Harvard Business Review reminds its readers. What are we measuring? And are we 1/10 as persistent as these woke warriors in rooting out the obstacles to our goals? But an equally important lesson is that we need to be awake to the woke and resist playing along in every way possible. And I mean in academia and media as much as in business. In its present form, the cult of diversity, which drives CDO adoption, is driven by a Marxist ideology which rejects all distinctions between people as corrosive of human fraternity. Religious people are increasingly unable to live public lives which give witness to the distinctions that the gospel asks us to make, distinctions arising from discipleship of Jesus Christ. Given the sheer magnitude of this trend and the size of the corporate and government resources behind it, finding creative ways to reverse the tide is of vital concern for the health of the nation. Short of this, we will all be bad economists soon enough. Let's not let that happen. Thank you.